Hi, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for joining us for this Data for Development seminar, where we are learning from collaborators in developing regions. This is a one-hour session that was recorded in the context of the UN World Data Forum in 2020. My name is Dominique Charon, and I am the Vice President of Programs and Partnerships branch here at the International Development Research Centre. Canada's IDRC has for 50 years been supporting research in the South by researchers in developing countries to tackle the issues that are key in their regions to overcome poverty and advance their societies sustainably and inclusively. Today's virtual discussion is part of our efforts to bring that evidence and knowledge from the global South into global discussions such as the World Data Forum. We all know that data and developing data and data systems are vital for monitoring and helping to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The global COVID-19 pandemic also shows how crucial it is to have data accessible for decision making. It needs to be made available in formats that allow it to be used by people who need it, by governments, by entrepreneurs, by innovators, and citizens. For example, our recently launched Artificial Intelligence and Data Science program in response to the pandemic is leveraging the power of data to combat the threats posed by the pandemic to health systems in developing regions. At the same time, data must also respect our privacy and reflect the needs of all citizens, especially those in traditionally marginalized communities. As a funder of research for development, data is at the core of our business. IDRC recognizes that data is a powerful tool for influencing policy, tracking progress, fostering accountability, and driving innovation. Our support and investment into data spans across a wide range of contexts and regions, and this includes, for example, our work to ensure that citizens are counted in civil registries and vital statistics and receive the benefits of being counted as part of data-driven decisions. And there was an article published in Nature Communications not long ago by one of our colleagues, Irina Dinku, where she was quoted in explaining how important it is to have strong civil registries in order to capture deaths and cause of deaths in order to be able to understand the impact the pandemic is having in countries. And many countries, if not most countries in developing regions, have incomplete and inadequate systems for capturing these most basic of data, such as births and deaths. And the knock-on effects in terms of decision-making in the context of a pandemic and more generally about how to allocate resources is then deeply felt. We'll be hearing from Irina later. The potential for data and digital technologies to bring about economic and social transformation is really important and one of the areas of work for IDRC. And this is how some of our research is supporting the way to help governments become more accountable and innovative at the same time in terms of offering services. Finally, the support to the ethical implementation of artificial intelligence is part of our research as well, so that, for instance, we can ensure that our response to the pandemic is smarter, includes everyone, and still respects privacy and does not make inequalities worse. So this is why IDRC has chosen to invest in synthesizing and understanding these key lessons on approaches to data for development and emphasizing the importance of players in the Global South. For instance, we've been collaborating with the World Bank to inform the next World Development Report that will be focusing on data. We will also be working on taking a worldwide baseline of the data situation through our support to the Global Data Barometer. We'll be exploring in greater depth how data can make a difference in our new priorities, establishing a resource center to gather good practices about data and education, governance, climate, food systems, and others. And we'll be putting particular energy on data in support of gender equality and the Sustainable Development Goal number 5. So to address those crucial gaps in data that mean that women, racialized communities, and a number of other vulnerable groups are being left behind. And we are seeking to make sure that data help address these gaps. We believe that gender gendered data are fundamental to any evidence-based effort to promote gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. Today's panel is focused on sharing those lessons and experience on data from a global Southern perspective. Today, our panelists are showcasing innovative solutions and examples from their own experience across different research, different efforts, different programs, and we will explore together how data and data systems can help inform development policies across diverse regions. As IDRC moves into our new 10-year strategy, we would like to explore how we can advance these issues around the global data agenda by investing in research that is adaptable across a variety of contexts. After these individual presentations, we'll be exploring ideas to build a more coherent agenda on data for development with an interactive discussion between the panelists. So now, it's my honor to introduce them. They're a diverse group of data experts, and their experience covers all corners of the globe. They will be speaking to their research and offer us valuable insights that are essential for moving the global data for development forward. So let us start first with Fabrizio. Fabrizio Scrolini is the Executive Director of the Open Data Latin American Initiative, or ILDA, and a member of the Open Data Network for Development. Fabrizio will be helping us to frame this conversation based on his experience and the recent consultations that we co-hosted with him and other experts in the Global South. Fabrizio, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dominique, and good morning, bonjour, buenos dias, here from Montevideo. I'm delighted to be here and sharing this panel with you and with colleagues around the world. At ILDA, we explore the use of data for development, and we have been doing that for the last 7 years in partnership with IDRC. ILDA is a fairly new organization and a project that emerged from the OD4D program at IDRC. So we are delighted to be here. We have been hearing a lot about data for the development as a term in the last 15 years or so. And indeed, that had an impact in terms of policies and in terms of several projects and development we have seen. We have seen the emergence of the open data community, people working and organizations working with data, with small data. And we have also seen a narrative emerging as data as the new oil. Unfortunately, such as the oil industry, and data has complexities and data has pitfalls, and we are also coming to terms with that. So in the last 15 years, we have seen this really spur of innovation and of uses and of debates, and reality is showing the complexity of this. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of communities working around data, on standardizing data and publishing it and analyzing it. And there are still a lot of silos in people that are working in this field. And often, we get very much into the debate about data and not into the debate about the challenge we are trying to address with data. And often we ignore questions about ethics, governance, and effectiveness of such interventions. At the end of the day, not all data was created equal, and often minorities and vulnerable groups are not accounted for, or in worst case scenarios, if they are accounted for, discrimination or other bad effects actually happen to them. So in a very complex world, we are coming to terms with this complexity, but also we are coming to terms with the evidence we have over the last 10 years that indeed the use of data, in particular open data, is helping in terms of improving service delivery, transparency and accountability, and also helping a lot of innovation in several disciplines. So as a result, it's a mixed picture what we have here, and that's the challenge ahead. I think that the global scenario for this debate has changed. On the one hand, revelation about the use of data by several powerful stakeholders, particularly in electoral processes, is now making this debate, more complex and less hopeful than in the early years. As a result, we need to face this. Also, the power of what we now frame as artificial intelligence, mostly machine learning tools, is increasingly shaping the way data is used by corporations, individuals, and governments. So we need to come as well to understand this in much better fashion than we used to do 10 years ago. Algorithms and decisions that are now being outsourced to algorithms are as good as the data they're fed with, and that data is often created by very imperfect institutions and human beings. And algorithms as well are created by very imperfect human beings. There is evidence that we need more capacity to engage with this, but not only from a technical perspective, which is always good to have good engineers, people working the nuts and bolts of this, but also in terms of regulatory capacity and in terms of understanding the societal and economic impact of this agenda 10 years on. And so it is important to look beyond the technical to understand these now imbricated processes in our society. And openness still remains at the center of this agenda. Without openness, we cannot foster collaboration, we cannot foster interdependence, and we cannot take into account the different realities and uses that we still need to understand, but also we need to understand that the scenario has changed. And then where do we go from here? That's interesting. Our report that emerged from a conference we held here in Montevideo when travel was still possible. There is a lot of uncertainty, and we are definitely living different experiences across the world according to our regulatory framework, our values, the way we see the use of data, and the power such use of data brings. But at a global level, I think an idea is emerging about the need of a sort of new data deal that will ensure inclusion, fairness, and respect for human dignity, rights, but also a way to foster innovation. So that balance is difficult to strike, and we still don't have a clear understanding on how this arrangement could be devised. But we do have some evidence of different potential futures that are emerging, and I will be more than glad to discuss this with you in the follow-up questions. I think the challenge now is to understand and to devise this new data deal. And from ILDA, we are more than happy to keep exploring these questions with you and our colleagues at IDRC. Many thanks for this.
Great. Thank you, Fabricio, and much to think about there. I love that sort of soundbite that not all data are created equal as we think about moving into global governance frameworks for data. And it's trying to govern something that is still quite new and young and dynamic. So lots of interesting challenges and needs for research. So I'm going to move now to our next speaker, and that's Piru Chung. Welcome. It's lovely to see you there. Piru, who's been working with IDRC on open data, and she is the director of the Open Development Management Institute. We're really keen to hear from you, Piru, on your experiences with data and indigenous communities in Southeast Asia, and also how the pandemic is impacting these communities. So thanks very much, and over to you, Piru.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dominic. Just to explain a little bit about the Open Development Initiative, we've been piloting and working in open data now across Southeast Asia for more than 7 years. And much of the work that we've been doing has really been a catalyst for increasing transparency across the region And more predominantly, we've been working with ethnic minority and Indigenous communities throughout Southeast Asia. And just to provide some context of the populations that we're working with, there's an estimated 411 million ethnic and Indigenous peoples that reside across Asia. It accounts for a third of all of the ethnic and Indigenous peoples globally. Now, this count is based upon national statistics that was generated in 2019, and it's likely that it's a huge, grossly underestimated statistic on the actual populations of these ethnic groups. And one of the main reasons why this is the case is because there is no provision for rights to self-determine in Asia. And that hinders not only their recognition to identify as Indigenous peoples, but it also deprives them of the right to govern their lands and territories across the region. And regardless of the fact that many of these states are signatory to international conventions that protect these rights. So as a result, across Southeast Asia, ethnic armed conflict is proliferating. And this, under current COVID restrictions, with the increase of restrictions and new legislations that has granted authoritarian governments across the region to restrict and hinder civic freedoms and movements, this has caused a state of emergency across the region for ethnic and Indigenous peoples who've already suffered a long extent of persecution throughout the region. The most prominent example is Myanmar, where ongoing conflict has resulted in extensive internet shutdowns, and this has prevented significant access to information. In the Philippines, movement restrictions under COVID has been selectively implemented to the extent that forest-dependent communities are no longer able to access their cultivated lands, and they're no longer able to access forest resources. This puts them at imminent risk of food shortages and potentially famine. So our work has tried to promote Indigenous data sovereignty across Southeast Asia as a mechanism to decentralize technology and data ecosystems. The program hopes to generate an enabling environment for IDS to contribute to broader data ecosystems, which decentralizes it from national systems, so that Indigenous peoples can exercise power and control over their data sovereignty. Our research has demonstrated a significant need for Indigenous peoples to have agency over their data and infrastructure systems, to ensure that they're visible in data, and to ensure greater representation and inclusion in policy development. The current context of Southeast Asia results in a data ecosystem that promotes data divides, and it perpetuates inconsistent, inaccurate, irrelevant data. It invests in external control and ownership of data. It incites mistrust that results in overexploitation of Indigenous data, and it doesn't provide support for data infrastructure and capabilities. And fundamentally, this leads to a representation of narratives of Indigenous peoples in a negative light. Indigenous data sovereignty deliberately repositions data back to Indigenous peoples and is defined as the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. Indigenous data governance is decision-making, and it requires the governance over data to own and control Indigenous data, and then to have the autonomy then to use that data for governance. And this speaks to the availability of quality data that's relevant to their context and their people for decision-making. Both these two components are necessary to strengthen Indigenous institutions, to increase the capacity to govern data, and in turn, build stronger evidence-based decision-making for national rebuilding. By promoting IDS, we hope to contribute to opportunities for peace building and ensure that no one is left behind, and most significantly, under SDG 16. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Piru. Really fascinating and alarming at the same time. I mean, that the number of people that you referred to, that statistic, the 411 million, probably quite a bit more than that, Indigenous and ethnic peoples across Asia, was very striking for me. And absolutely, these issues around the quality of data, their access to data, and how they are represented in data that is incomplete and inaccurate is creating new kinds of problems. So we'll look forward to getting into that discussion in a moment. Next, I'd like to pass the virtual podium to Ramesh Silva, who is currently working with the UN Population Fund. Thank you, Ramesh, for joining us. And he'll be talking to us about civil registration and vital statistics and the work of IDRC's Center of Excellence and how it has been interacting with the fund in helping address these issues around data gaps that I mentioned earlier in my introduction. Ramesh, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dominique. It's a pleasure to be here as part of this discussion. I have a few slides. Let me share my screen just to provide some visual aids to my remarks. Is the slides okay? Great. Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about a joint initiative between the IDRC Center of Excellence on Civil Registration and Vital Statistics Systems and the United Nations Population Fund, Converge, Connecting Vital Events Registration and Gender Equality. So only about 65% of all births are registered globally, and only 1/3 of the world's approximately 55 million deaths are recorded through civil registration systems. And up to 80% of deaths that occur outside of health facilities go uncounted. The vital events of women and girls are on average under-registered at much higher levels than those for men and boys. This has been described as a scandal of invisibility. Civil registration and vital statistics systems are absolutely critical to ensuring people's basic human rights and their legal identity across the life course. And then secondly, CRVS systems are a fundamental tool for monitoring and evaluating population health. Put simply, to make everyone count, we need to count everyone. So the Converge Initiative is a partnership between the Center of Excellence and the UN Population Fund, and we're working to change this situation. We're focusing on the gender dimensions that lead to exclusion from civil registration systems and the invisibility of different people, particularly women and girls. We're working to transform these systems into gender-sensitive systems and systems which are sensitive to issues which lead to exclusion. Our approach, takes on a life course approach where we're focusing on everything from birth registration through to death registration, including marriage and divorce. Our own work takes a gender-sensitive approach to CRVS strengthening, using systematic assessment of the completeness and the quality of civil registration systems, and disaggregating these data to understand where are the blind spots and the gaps. And then advancing and building on that, trying to understand what are the determinants, what are the key factors which lead to exclusion of certain subpopulations. And lastly, we're trying to transform the vital statistics space and build a culture of vital statistics production, dissemination, and usage, whereby people actively use civil registration data and in all types of forums, whether it's in government forums or by civil society and the private sector. Let me move to vital statistics. It's widely recognized that civil registration is the preferred and the best source for the production of vital statistics on fertility, mortality, nuptiality, and basic population dynamics. This graph on the left-hand side shows the vital statistics production capacity over the last 5 years or so in West and Central Africa. The United Nations Principles and Recommendations on Vital Statistics Systems outline 30 core minimum vital statistics tabulations and outputs that are considered the absolute minimum standard in terms of producing key statistics, key vital statistics. As you can see here, most countries across West and Central Africa struggle to produce all 30. In fact, most are only producing about 10 to 13 of these tables. And further, a lot of these vital statistics outputs are not sex disaggregated and lack detailed geographic disaggregation as well. And so, and then one needs to remember with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, death registration has become much, much harder, particularly during times of lockdown and shelter in place instructions. And so our civil registration systems have been further perturbed. And so the challenges are real in terms of really harnessing civil registration systems and producing meaningful and representative vital statistics across time and space. Let me close by outlining a few key take-home messages here. You know, as we're really moving into the decade of action towards the 2030 landmark for the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, the key piece here is to understand that, you know, women and girls, you know, the exclusion of women and girls from civil registration and vital statistics systems exacerbates gender inequality. What's needed here is a holistic life course approach, you know, from birth registration right through to death registration, but also engaging marriage and divorce. Sex disaggregated monitoring of vital statistics is fundamental to understand and identify gender disparities and understand how to improve incomplete and deficient civil registration systems and where to marshal more resources for these systems. Marriage and divorce registration is often neglected and is a key mechanism for the protection of particularly of women's rights in a relationship. And lastly, what we've been finding, you know, and continue to advance as part of the Converge Initiative is an integrated approach is critical here. You know, integrating census data, survey data, and qualitative research are key to assessing sex differentials in civil registration systems. In particular, in collaboration with the IDRC Center of Excellence, we're developing a whole new program of social norms and behavioral research, which draws on a number of qualitative methods to really understand why certain vital events are registered and others are not, and who's being left out. These are not random events, but rather there are specific reasons, often due to cultural norms or certain power dynamics in terms of who has the authority or who doesn't have the authority to register a vital event. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ramesh. And absolutely, this, I would say, unsung source of information and data around civil registration and vital statistics and its importance in informing the allocation of resources across government and society is so key. And the problems with it in being so incomplete mean that so many people and so many segments of societies are invisible, and the potential of these systems to make them visible if those systems were more complete, particularly women and girls. A common theme running through many of the presentations today. So our last speaker today is Jane Abbott. She's an engineer at the, oh yes, great named organization, Retro Rabbit. And she will be talking to us about how machine learning research is key. And in fact, there's research needed to help machine learning be more useful in local languages. Fascinating work, and Jade, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the intro. It's great to be here. So, as you mentioned, kind of machine learning is very much driven by the existence of data. And this means sort of a couple of things. We cannot build AI tools without data. And more than often in developing nations, that data is not available or is not in a accessible state or a good state. And the second part is that your AI tools, in essence, reflect the biases of data. And this can have very destructive effects. If we're looking at computer vision type of applications, there can be very destructive issues of deploying models with regards to race or with regards to gender. If we look at natural language processing, which is kind of your text or speech based AI, anything from being able to like translation tools, or all the way to kind of these speech assistants, to maybe even translating educational material, these also can exhibit biases. And the biases we typically see are that majority of it is in English. Majority of the research is done in English. Majority of the data that's available, given how much is available online, is done in English. But the truth is, 30% of all living languages today are African. And yet, despite that, less than 0.1% of the author affiliations of the largest NLP conferences around the world were actually based in Africa. Kind of looking at this picture here, this is the normalized publication count by country from one of the largest conferences. And you can see there's this kind of empty area over the continent of Africa, but also many other parts of the world. And we kind of want to ask the question why. And I think it's important we ask the question, well, why is that the case? Why is English the only thing you see, or French or Spanish? And I invite everyone to think of this quote by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, author of Decolonizing the Mind. And it is this: the effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity and in their capacities, and ultimately themselves. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in his book, talks about being a child growing up in rural Kenya, where he was punished for speaking between his friends his native language of Kikuyu. In the same vein, authors who are writing in their languages were imprisoned for this. It starts to become clear why data then is not necessarily available in these African languages, why they aren't so prevalent. So this is quite an involved little graph I've got here, but if we were to kind of start at the beginning with the content creator in the digital world has the ability to do so because they have access to keyboards, they have access to an online platform, they have access to electricity. Your translators have a demand. There's a demand for translation between languages. So if in English and French, perhaps, or English and Spanish, there's a demand for people to communicate. And this kind of boils down around the whole cycle of like, when we need translation data, so a sentence in language A and a sentence in language B, and we need thousands of those, or millions of them even. Those kind of get collated into these data sets, and those are what feed, for example, translation tools. Language technologists then build a translation tool, out comes a model, and that needs to be now evaluated. And this might if you put this in the context of kind of English to French, this cycle performs really well in this. Whereas if you take this and you now put it in kind of this more low-resourced environments such as African languages or Africa in general, you'll see that each one of these steps is hindered in some way. The content that people use to drive the creation of these tools, or even the labeling, even the translation, does not exist on the internet. Kind of a chicken and the egg problem. No one knows that there's going to be, no one's going to seek African language articles or literature online because they don't expect it to be there. And because no one expects it to be there, there's no demand for it to be put there. And at the same time, a lot of these Western countries will come in and say, we're going to build a translation tool. Western company will come build a translation tool, they'll build another NLP tool, and they'll output a model, and they have no idea whether the model works because they actually don't have speakers or language technologists who can actually speak the languages involved in building those models. And so this sort of inspired us to found an initiative called Masakane. And Masakane is kind of a participatory research effort for NLP for African languages that is open source, open data, continent-wide, and distributed and online. What's interesting is under lockdown, we continued as is. So we've been around for, I think, a year now. We're probably at our anniversary, and nothing changed. We have our weekly meetings online, and I think we were one of the few groups that were very, very minorly affected. And the goal of Masakane is to kind of build these cross-disciplinary NLP researchers, kind of connect them, grow them, and further research to enable things from language preservation all the way to tools that could be used within society and kind of increase the global visibility and relevance of these languages. For kind of the global NLP research community, we believe that these African languages can actually enrich what people are working on. They pose a number of really interesting challenges since they're very different from the ones that are primarily looked at. And for research communities, we're trying to discover what might be best practices for distributed research to be applied to other emerging research communities. And in our year, we've had a number of successes. We have around 400 participants at varying degrees of participation levels from over 21 African countries, with a couple from abroad. We've built 40 translation models, and just to contextualize, these are translation models based on what data is available. We'll get a little bit into why these cannot be used in practice. For 29 African language, that's actually more now. That stat's wrong. It's about 38, I think. 32 contributors on GitHub, and we've managed to get a number of papers accepted. With that, in doing this, we've realized that one of the key issues is that we don't have access to this data. So as a result, participants who want to promote or build these models have gone and started initiatives within the countries from where these languages originate to collect data. And the kind of approach that they've gone with is collecting data that they feel was representative of their culture, their language, their country. And that turns out to be really important when deploying tools. A tool that has been trained on Anglo-centric data or Western-centric data, text data, even if it's been translated and we deploy it in an African context, they actually perform a lot worse because they don't know the names of things. They don't know the places. They don't understand the people. They don't necessarily have the fully fledged dialogue. We did an interesting evaluation of the models, and it kind of pointed to a number of the huge issues that actually do exist at kind of all points of the process. So there was a demand kind of during the early days of the pandemic to do translation of COVID-19 surveys. So the idea here was actually to use these surveys to gather data from developing nations. And they didn't necessarily have access to people who would be able to translate it. So they said, can we not translate using your tools? And we said, well, we suspect there are going to be some problems, but we do have a number of people who speak all these languages. So let's use it as an opportunity to evaluate the models that we've built. And because here are a number of issues. So one example is religious text data. So the religious data is the most translated text data in the world. And that's primarily the source from which these models could be built. Kind of results in a biblification of translation. So it would randomly substitute biblical names within a COVID-19 survey, for example. Often there's a missing vocabulary, which does not exist or does not exist in the small amount of data sources we have, which either needs to be created and agreed upon. Something that was trained in a slightly different dialect and from the data of a slightly different dialect did not actually, change or cross languages very well. And even things from unaffected keyboards, it's often more difficult to type in these languages. The writing systems by which these languages are written are often very unsuitable. They've taken what was used for English and many other languages and malfitted it towards African languages. That said, we've had kind of a nice widespread success. This is a graph that I think we put together in April, so it actually has been updated. And here you can see kind of the widespread amount of submissions we've had, as well as where our participants are coming from, which is sort of a really great thing to see. So the thing I'd like to sort of leave you with is this idea of Masakane, which loosely translated means we build together. All these things that appeared, all these little issues that we had to solve, we solved together quickly because everyone was in the same room. The language technologists who build these translation models also spoke the languages, also understood the societies with which they came from. They were additionally able to go find more data because when you're living in a country, you know what institutions exist you can go speak to access data, whether that be, we had a number of cool initiatives coming from Parliament, where Parliament meant to publish all this translated data and they don't. Turns out there's just a technology issue. We just had to navigate that. As well as we've had kind of volunteers just come out and say, well, we don't want the only data that exists about African languages to be biblical, so we're going to start translating scientific terms, and we're going to start translating our academic theses so that we can kind of ensure that this is what we want captured about our cultures. So yeah, that's the thought I'd like you to hang on to, is we build together. It's a participatory approach.
Thanks very much, Jade. So we've had really fascinating contributions on this issue, and certainly we're hearing from Jade even this issue of how Indigenous people in the areas where you have been working have been marginalized by what you called a cultural bomb, and this resonates for us in Canada as well, with the history of our government's efforts from the 60s right through, well, from even earlier, but particularly from the 60s onwards, to have Indigenous children educated in or placed in non-Indigenous families and educated not in their language from the residential schools even before that over the centuries. So it's been quite traumatic for Indigenous peoples, and this cultural bomb, I think, refers to it. It's also been termed genocide, a cultural genocide. So not an insignificant issue, connects also to what you were saying, Piru, about this huge number of Indigenous peoples and ethnic groups in Asia, and I'm sure this resonates in all regions of the world, how they're being excluded. Ramesh used very elegantly and with examples from different parts of the world, illustrated how the exclusion of women in society is translated into the exclusion of women in civil in vital statistics systems, and the perpetuation of that inequality in terms of access to service is clear. And if we go right back to Fabricio at the beginning, where you said not all data are created equal, and certainly not all data and applications of AI and other technologies are in the public interest. And the intersection of the quality of the data, as Jade was saying, the ability of these new technologies to actually do things that make any kind of sense in languages that are not well represented in the data, and for information that are accessed by people to be relevant to them. Because of that gap is really a problem. And yet we are having huge applications of these technologies now by governments, by companies, and transforming the way we live, transforming the way we work, transforming the way we think. Much to talk about.
So that's a tough one, and it's only one. I think that the key consideration will be to make sure that everyone that needs to be on the table is on the table. So, and that's tough because that put us in a very complex position, an uncomfortable position to understand the levels of privilege that implies that I am talking to you here right now, while roughly 60% or more Latin Americans are unable to do so, and the same replicates across the region and my country. So that's tough, and that includes other biases that my colleagues already referred, and I had the pleasure of learning from them about gender and about ethnicity and so on. And I think that's something we might need to work setting bridges and also understanding the role that capacity building and engaging with a wider audience demands. And this is not technical fit; it's a human fit. It's a soft skills fit, and that will demand from us a lot of effort. And I guess the other consideration, very briefly, is fairness, and the experience needs to be grounded in the best that our societies have to offer. So in Latin America, we do have a tradition. We have the best and the worst world, right? Like we had a tradition of dictatorships and serious issues about the rule of law, but also a tradition of regaining democracy and standing for those rights. And any experience we are going to have in developing this kind of technology needs to be grounded on our traditions as well, which are not going to be exactly the same all over the world. But I think that each region, each history has a way of understanding this that has to be grounded on some common ground on human dignity. And I guess that's the challenge for a global perspective on this, and particularly for a regional perspective on this. And that will be my contribution to this. And I'm very thankful from learning from you and from my colleagues this morning here in Montevideo. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Fabrizio. And I think really what you said about the layers of privilege and representation really touched really beautifully on a lot of what was said here today. And I think naturally kind of leads into the answer from hearing from our next panelist here, Peru. Interested to what your take is on this question. And yeah, Fabrizio, I think what you said lends itself really beautifully to kind of what the conversation has been centered on here this morning. Peru?
I want to also highlight human decency and just fundamental rights that need to be afforded. And I think one of the most important issues that we need to take into account in Southeast Asia and across Asia more broadly is safety and security. And I think that's been highlighted during COVID. I highlighted the example in Myanmar and the Philippines, but you've got civic unrest in Thailand at the moment around democracy issues. You have Malaysia's access to freedom restrictions perpetuating. You've got human rights and freedoms of expression shutdowns, freedoms of association in Vietnam, in Laos, Cambodia. All of these aspects are really constraining your average citizen, let alone those that are marginalized. And to the extent that those that are marginalized, it's even worse. Because any data that's generated about them, on behalf of them, without their control, is usually used without their consent to further divest them of rights and basic fundamental human rights. And this has been escalated during COVID because everyone is locked down. Nobody's paying attention. And so communities are not being able to articulate what is happening because they don't have the infrastructure, the connectivity to be able to get these messages out as effectively. So building and investing in decentralized technology that repossesses and redistributes that power and that accessibility to technology and data and information to them to be able to control that is absolutely crucial for data governance.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think you bring so many valid points about the layers. There's so much happening. It's not just about not being represented or not having informed consent. There are layers to already existing inequalities, already existing biases that again complicate the situation and just add so many layers and layers of considerations. And I really think a lot of what Jade touched on as well, there are so many synergies between our conversations this morning. And Romesh, I'm excited to hear your perspective on this, kind of leading from what Pairu has said.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chelsea and colleagues. Let me build a little bit, not only on what Pairu said, but also Jade Abbott's framing of Masakane, building together. I think it's a profound and very deep framing. And I think it's critical for civil registration and vital statistics and inclusiveness of these kinds of data systems. What we've seen in the field of official administrative data systems in general and civil registration and vital statistics systems in particular over recent decades is a supply side mentality, an approach of we'll build this data system and people will come and it'll all just kind of work itself out, and technology will be a silver bullet and really advance, and make the system more efficient and therefore inclusive. And we see time and time again that that's just not the case. And I think we've heard a number of examples today of how that plays out. In the field of civil registration and vital statistics, what's really needed here is a more balanced approach, which not only does address some of the supply side issues, but takes front and center consideration of the demand side factors, the individual perspectives of how these systems shape people's lives and how accessible they are. Very much a human rights-centric approach, a human-centered design approach, if you will, in terms of addressing these kinds of gaps and inequities in terms of inclusion. Birth registration is a profound act of the state. It's essentially the state acknowledging you are a human being, and therefore you have basic human rights. And that flows through, across the life course with marriage, divorce, and death registration. And so what we really need to do is engage these different communities in terms of understanding how to shift administrative data systems like CRVS systems to be more accessible and be shaped around some of the cultural traditions and social and economic factors in different places, and move away from a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. And I think, Pairu and Jade and Fabrizio said it beautifully, as CRVS is an official statistical system, and it's a system which actually needs to work very, very closely with many, many different partners, religious institutions, indigenous communities, many, many different facets of civil society. And so this is actually what's really, really key, alongside of the traditional, quantitative demographic data quality assessments and, statistical wizardry, which one needs to evaluate the data in a scientific manner. There also needs to be these other pieces which really draw on, anthropology and qualitative research, qualitative field research. And so I think, that's what I would say, absolutely critical to bring in this human-centered design approach. with a lot of different partners and different communities.
Thank you so much, Ramesh. I love the term statistical wizardry. But I think a lot of what you said again has touched on what everybody has said here today. And something that you said when you're talking about human-centered approaches to doing CRVS and to improving data governance, talking about dignity, the dignity of people, like Fabrizio and Pairu had mentioned, and really considering what do people need and what can best benefit people, and not just people that are like myself or like yourself, or like people who are in those decision-making roles that really can affect the lives of other people, but people across context, people across every context, and really considering the layers of privilege and oppression and everything else and realities of people across different contexts to make a more holistic picture and to capture a more realistic picture of what's actually happening. And Jade, I am so excited to pass this question over to you, especially after everything that was said, and hear a bit more about the build together approach and your take on this. So Jade, I'll pass that over to you.
So I think everything kind of ties nicely together. We've had mention of decentralization. We've had mention of human-centered design. We've had mention of decentralizing oneself in the narrative. So us, in a privileged position, are probably going to be the people who will be building the systems or will be implementing the systems. And how can we decentralize our own narratives to ensure a participatory approach, to say we are not the thing, we are not the expert, we are not the people we're building for, and then kind of relinquish that and say, cool, what can we learn from the societies where these are being deployed, because those are the people that matter. And I think the thing I don't know, I've written about 1,000 notes that I wanted to say in this question, but this idea that data is just people, right? There is people behind data. The data points represent a person. If a data point does not exist, then that person, if we're doing governance on it, then that person does not exist. If the data is misrepresented, then that person is then misrepresented. The data represents a culture, it represents a language, it represents a science, it represents a lot more, because it's representative of the people. If we're not capturing the data right, we are skewing narratives. So yeah, I also like this touch on uncomfortability, because that's what it is. It's when we are uncomfortable, we know we are probably doing a much better job. When we start feeling how awful everything might be or could be for people, then I think we're on the right track.
Thank you very much. I mean, my last message will be actually echoing Jade's project. Massacana, let's build this together. And so that implies a commitment to acknowledge where we are, what we do, who we are, and the level of power sometimes we bring to this table, and make sure that it's distributed and acknowledged by all actors building these powerful systems. As Ramesh also mentioned, as Piru also mentioned, I mean, these systems do have the power to make visible thousands of people that usually wouldn't be visible, but we also need to make sure that visibility brings dignity, and our tools embrace ways of reaching to them and delivering either services or creating with them new services that will actually foster a better experience in this journey. So thank you very much.
I also love that data are people, and I love that we all recognize that data are people, and we are in the privileged position to actually acknowledge that. I think a lot of the communities that we work with in Southeast Asia don't recognize that, because they don't see data. They don't see data in bits and bytes the way we see data and the way that we're articulating that here now. And data and knowledge, especially Indigenous and ethnic knowledge, can be captured in so many diverse ways that technology just hasn't got the answer to yet. And I think we need to acknowledge that, and we need to look at really closely the diversity of people and the diversity of those data points and how to capture them effectively to actually benefit those people, to actually benefit everybody equally. And that's why I'm a real advocate that working on Indigenous data sovereignty is not a side agenda. It's an agenda that can be replicated in other minority groups and other minority constituents of society that don't recognize the benefit and the power of data. So that's my last message.
That was beautiful. These messages, I love them. I feel like they are just a call to action, and yeah, so rich. I will pass it over to Ramesh.
Thanks a lot, Chelsea. For colleagues in the civil registration and vital statistics world, I think what we need is, a recognition that the perfect should not be the enemy of the good here. There's a culture of like arguing, oh, we can't, produce vital statistics because the system's incomplete, it's deficient. And then then there's not really a continuous and evaluation and interrogation of both the strengths and the weaknesses of these data systems. Things like the fundamental principles of official statistics and, the move to open data systems really allows both official statistical systems and their partners to publish vital statistics, even when they're incomplete and deficient. But what's needed here is good documentation around what are the gaps and what are the limitations of the data and how might they be further addressed going forward. And so we've seen that very much in COVID-19, where a number of countries, even that have incomplete and deficient civil registration systems, like Ecuador, for example, have been excellent in moving to publication of weekly and monthly vital statistics, even though there's massive problems. But what it's done is opened up these data systems for scientific researchers and public health experts to engage them with other data and to better understand how these systems can be improved.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Ramesh. I love "Don't let the perfect get in the way of doing good." Yes. Jade, over to you.
Cool. I'm going to end with a quote. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the author I quoted earlier, remarks, it tells a story of a community theatre he was involved with, and they'd approached him, and it's in a kind of rural outskirts of Nairobi. And what was different about this theatre is that because of the space they had available, all practices had to happen in the open. And this is his little story. This is as follows, and I think it's kind of got some sort of reflection back to what we're talking about. Auditions and rehearsals, for instance, were in the open. I must say this was initially forced on us by the empty space, but is also part of the growing conviction that democratic participation, even in the solution of artistic problems, however slow and chaotic it seemed, was producing results of the highest artistic order, and was forging a communal spirit in a community of artistic workers. PhDs from the University of Nairobi, PhDs from the universities of the factories and the plantation, PhDs from Gorky's University of the Streets, per se. Each person's worth was judged by the scale of each person's contribution to the group effort. Open auditions and the rehearsals, with everybody seeing all the elements that went into making a whole, had the effect of demystifying the theatrical process. And I think this kind of highlights, once again, the decentralization narrative, but also the idea of, making the system mustn't be other. The system, the data system, the data gathering system should be part of the society. It should be communally built. And yeah, he goes on to say one last thing, which I thought was also great, is Kabarithi practice, which is the name of the theatre, was part of education as a process of demystifying knowledge and hence reality. So instead of making knowledge and data this It kind of talks back to what Peru was talking about. Knowledge and data is this thing that gets gathered about you. It is now demystified. So yeah, that's my thought captured in a quote.
Wow, the book is called Decolonizing the Mind. Hey. Okay, I think there's going to be an influx of orders coming through right after this session ends. That is so rich, and I love that. And it just makes me think about what we value when you're talking, whose input the system currently actually values, and whose knowledge and input we're saying is important, and really, okay, how do we change that? Wow, that was beautiful. I am feeling so inspired. I am feeling so fired up. I don't know about everybody else. I feel like this session was really just a call to action. And yeah, I'm feeling mega inspired. I speak for myself, but I think I also speak for all of our colleagues on the call. And just a massive thank you to our panelists and for their very rich insight and for speaking so eloquently. And I feel like making data and these considerations accessible to a range of specialties across this call, and who will ultimately be viewing this at the World Data Forum. So I really thank you. Thank you all our colleagues for joining, and Dominique for initially moderating, and Katie and Fernando and Morgan and anybody else I've forgotten at IDRC for really helping organize and bring the session together.